Welcome to Adam Goldberg, an unauthorized autobiography. Episode 2. Day 4. The next morning, which was indeed a morning, as Adam's sleep had been so restless the night before he threw in the towel after roughly 5 hours, Adam enjoyed a lightly toasted sunflower butter and jam sandwich with his kombucha. He'd been eating quite a few SBJs in recent years. Maybe, he mused, the method actor in him was preparing for this memoir all along. That by infantilizing his morning meals, he was in a sense inhabiting the child whose life he would mine for this epic remembrance. Would he, like James Joyce before him, use sensory episodes to trigger memories? Is that what happens in Ulysses? Or was that Proust? Or both? He wasn't entirely sure. He hadn't read either, though he owned various editions. He had all but stopped reading fiction more than a decade ago when he read Despair, Nabokov's take on Dostoevsky's The Double, which Adam owned but never read. In fact, it inspired a film concept Adam wrestled with for some time but could never see through to its conclusion. At the time, Adam was also still smoking and sunbathing before a pre-cancer mole was discovered, and he had to quit sunbathing too. He attributed his wildly disproportionate book-owned-to-read ratio to undiagnosed ADHD, and this recent self-diagnosis provided him with the justification he had sought for his quasi-literacy for years. He had once been sure that after he dropped out of Sarah Lawrence, he would pursue an autodidactic education with a fervor he couldn't muster when the reading was institutionally required of him. But other than a spate of Roman noir and Bukowski novels he devoured during his year of college and subsequent dropout, this never really came to pass. And now, with more than half of his life in the can, it had become fairly evident that simply owning the great books was going to have to suffice. Every moment reading, he'd often rationalized, was a moment he could be writing or making something. But to be clear, every moment he wasn't reading was most certainly not spent writing or making something. John Tottenham, the sardonic British writer and artist whom he first met working at Book Soup in the early 1990s, had once assured him that he needn't bother reading, that he was constitutionally literate. Until his recent ADHD self-diagnosis, this explanation appeased and flattered Adam, though he suspected his friend was being kind or just relished that particular turn of phrase. Adam often feared he may be the worst of all possible worlds, a himbo trapped in the body of an intellectual, neither here nor there, which wasn't such a bad title for his memoir, come to think of it. In either case, it did occur to him that something about how he'd been dreaming and eating these past few years might have been priming him for this endeavor. Or, he thought, maybe he just liked to start off the day sweet rather than salty. In either case, he was spent. Between the lack of sleep and the tennis lessons he was due to have in a couple of hours, he wasn't sure he could sit today. While Adam hadn't explicitly made this deal with himself, the unspoken dogma by which he endeavored to write this book would entail sitting each day with his laptop open to the Pages app, all other windows closed for 365 days, a variation of the egg timer method in which you set a timer for 20 minutes, an hour, whatever, and you write what you write or you don't write at all, no matter. When the time was up, it was time to stand. This low-pressure methodology appealed to Adam, but he felt he needed to lower the stakes further still by merely committing to sitting. The hardest part, after all, was the sitting, was it not? He had heard this. Hadn't he read it in one of the 5 books on writer's block he owned but never completed? He was beginning to wonder, though. It wasn't really that hard to sit. The writing appeared to be the challenging aspect to writing. So he did what every actor does when they don't know what to do, and Adam called his manager. The call immediately went to voicemail as he concurrently received a text. "In the hills, call you back." Adam rolled his eyes, sighed, stood up, and began to stretch out his spine, neck, glutes, and calves. He had begun taking tennis lessons recently, and it was taking its toll, particularly on his C4, C5, and the referred pain to his shoulder and right arm, in addition to inducing suboccipital neuralgia, which had intermittently afflicted him for years. This tennis renaissance also seemed curious to him. In addition to being in near constant pain, which serving in particular only exacerbated, he hadn't played tennis with any regularity since he was 11 or 12, around the time he began to eschew sports for being a neurotic. He was, ironically, naturally athletic, like his father Earl, whom he loved to remind people, particularly the white supremacists who trolled him on social media, was Jewish, hearty and healthy still, even as he approached 90. Earl was a college lifeguard in the 1950s and a lifelong surfer until only recently, while it was his non-Jewish mother and his maternal heritage writ large from which he insisted he inherited his anxiety, loquaciousness, and somatic preoccupations, traits most often attributed to Ashkenazi genes. In a sense, Adam had been reliving much of his childhood for the last decade, as one does when they have children. He began to see his childhood with more clarity as he taught his boys to throw and catch and swing a racket and what to do if you feel nauseous or frightened or sleepless. It felt as if he could almost reach out and touch his childhood, but it appeared distant and small, as though he were viewing it through the wrong end of a telescope. It was more distant, he felt, than it needed to be, having waited so long to have children. Roxanne and all his parent peers were a decade younger than he was, and it was just enough to make him feel like a stranger in a strange land. Not quite here, not quite there. And it didn't help that he had less connection these days to the friends with whom he'd grown up. One of these pals, whom countless would claim as their best friend, Rio Hackford, had recently died of a rare optical cancer. These last 3 years without Rio, Adam had begun to feel untethered to a seminal portion of his life. Not so much his high school, where he had met Rio, but more his 20s and the 90s, which he imagined would be the focal point of the career highlights of this unwritten book, if not its selling point. Another brother-like friend, we'll call him Holden, whom he met the day he began 7th grade, and with whom he had been close for decades, but whose dysfunction and near social paralysis had only worsened over the years, had all but disappeared from his life once Adam had kids, around the time Holden decided to treat himself to a midlife LSD addiction. He was effectively gone. As was Nick, the actor and collaborator to which he was closest for more than a decade, whom he'd met on the set of the movie that ruined them and most of their castmates for any other experience, Dazed and Confused. Nick, as Clint, kicked Adam as Mike's ass in Dazed, and a few years later, Adam wrote them each versions of themselves for his directorial debut, Scotch and Milk, an ode to film, jazz, loss, and friendship. They were all of a mess of a kind back then, but Nick's increasingly bizarre behavior, fueled by too much beer and weed, made friendship with him untenable. He had alienated nearly everyone who was close to him, even Rio, whose tent was huge and patience almost infinite. Rio finally clocked him one night in a New Orleans casino as Nick took a sloppy drunken swing at him. But Nick, at least, was alive. Until a couple of weeks ago, when Adam received a text from a mutual friend he hadn't spoken to in years. And Adam knew he was dead the moment he received the cryptic text, which simply asked Adam to call him. Nick had hung himself, and though it had been 20 years since Adam last spoke to him, the already massive fault line between Adam's life then and his life now had been cleaved further still. He had known this time would come, this parade of loss, but he assumed it would arrive much later in life, or at least a little later. The first real tragedy that befell Adam, who had previously convinced himself that he'd be one of those people in perpetual fear of mortality, but whom along with his compatriots would defy its grip, took place in 2005 when he lost John Glick. John had been Adam's roommate the 1 year he spent at Sarah Lawrence, famous for its wildly disproportionate female-to-male ratio, proclivity to protest any and everything, and an ice cream bar that Yoko Ono donated to the cafeteria. Prior to 2005, 1989 held the title for Adam's worst year, a year in which he'd often claim he had a bona fide nervous breakdown, having spent much of his short time at Sarah Lawrence either on the toilet or next to it, weeping on the phone to his mother in the darkest, smallest hours. It had gotten so bad that the progressive staff, particularly his freshman studies sociology teacher, rallied him to finish the year by allowing him to watch movies and write about them in lieu of any actual coursework. His stomach was so bad, his anxiety so off the charts, he was living primarily off of plain bagels, New York seltzer, and so much NyQuil, which he used as a sleep aid, that his RA had once called the Poison Control Center after spying Adam and John's floor littered with empty bottles. But John had been an anchor. Adam had won the roommate lottery, and he knew it from the moment John walked through the door carrying egg crates of LPs, the most visible of which was Elvis Costello's Armed Forces. Elvis was everything to Adam, literally, so John played him everything else from the class of 77 and those who influenced them and the bands they themselves spawned. John would be for years to Adam what Spotify would be to generations later. In the summer of 2005, while Adam was driving east on the 10 after therapy in the Palisades, he received a nondescript voicemail from one of John's best friends in Chicago. It wasn't a friend he had any independent relationship with, let alone whose number he had. He knew John was dead. And now he had to make a phone call and somehow managed to endure the confirmation of something so unthinkable. He braced himself and dialed the phone just as his black Mercury Marauder began to emerge from the ubiquitous coastal haze. John and two coworkers, all three local indie rockers on a lunch break from their day jobs at Shore Microphones, were rear-ended at a red light by a young woman trying to commit suicide by driving as fast as she possibly could into the first car she saw. She was fine, and only succeeded in killing the three men, barely in their 30s. Adam got off the phone with John's friend, steely and numb. It wasn't until he found himself driving aimlessly down the 10, missing one exit after another, that he finally pulled off the freeway somewhere in South Central and called their mutual friend and Sarah Lawrence alum James, that he began to convulsively cry. But not as much as he would a few days later in Chicago when he attempted to eulogize John at his packed funeral. He thought he might collapse or vomit. Adam had simply never felt that way. It was the first time he felt breathlessly mournful. But it wouldn't be the last. The phone rang, vibrating on the counter next to his open laptop and empty cereal bowl. Adam saw it was his manager and answered. "Hey, Matt. How you doing?"
"I'm okay. I don't know. Just got out of hot yoga, and I think I have a rash,"
Matt casually confided. "Jesus Christ, man. Will you stop going to hot yoga? Regular yoga is hot enough."
No, I know. You don't think it's measles, do you?"
Matt asked. "Jesus, I don't know. Were you vaccinated as a kid? Christ, that reminds me. I was going to get a booster," Adam remembered.
"Yeah, me too. I don't know."
Fucking RFK Jr.
"Yeah, right? Look, have you heard anything about the show?"
Matt asked. The show in question was the aforementioned The Equalizer reboot, which had just wrapped its 5th season, and the fate of which hung in the balance. No, I don't know. I'm assuming it's going to be one more season. They canceled everything else. I'm sure they would have done it already. Isn't this your job? Adam responded.
"Yeah, no, I just wanted to see if you had any inside information."
No, but whatever. Listen, I'm writing a memoir, Adam said with performative conviction before glancing back at his blankish laptop screen. The blinking cursor smirked back.
"I love it,"
Matt exalted. Well, I don't know if I'm writing it. I'm conceiving of it. I'm wrestling with its framework.
"You gonna put the Denzel story in it?"
I don't know. Maybe. It's not meant to be like a tell-all. I don't think. I don't know.
No, of course, but so funny. What did he throw, an apple?
I don't know. I think it was a grape. He was just cranky, and me and Val kept making jokes during rehearsal.
Didn't you say Val thought he was a dry drunk?
Is that what you want me to write? I may want to get hired again. I haven't retired,
No, I'm just saying, throwing fruit is funny.
Yeah, I may want to tell the Tarantino story, Adam added.
You may as well. Guy's never going to hire you.
Anyway, this thing is going to be more nonlinear, I think. Like, sort of Wild Strawberries meets Ulysses or Proust or something. There was a long pause. Matt, you there?
Sorry, I'm going into the hills.
I thought you just came out of the hills.
Different hills,
Matt clarified. Okay, but you know what I mean? I don't think anybody cares about Eddie from Friends, per se. But if I approach it more like a sort of, more as a story or, I don't know.
Look, I'll set something up at the agency. They have a book department. You can spitball.
Oh, okay. That's good. I just don't want to sit here busting my ass on another project where I'm just, spinning my wheels for a year or whatever, and it just ends up being some solipsistic exercise.
No, it'll be great. Write the thing. Then maybe someone options it and it's a show or a movie you direct.
That was it. This finally made sense. He'd approached the thing as IP, the industry's favorite initials, which stood for intellectual property, a charitable description of most of the property to which it referred. Anyway, that would be his angle. It would take the pressure off. He no longer had to think of himself as a dumb actor posing as an author, so much as he would be the content itself. He'd basically be writing a novelization of the movie of his life in advance of the movie he seemed never able to make without getting in his own way. Adam shut his laptop and grabbed his racket, a renewed pep in his bunioned shuffle. Day 5. This morning, it was yet again actually morning, as Adam had risen more or less with the rest of the family to accompany them to a drop-off and attend the children's spring play, in which Bud played a monkey and Sonny played a variety of creatures and elements. Fortunately, he had managed to get to sleep at a reasonable hour, having been exhausted from the lack of sleep the prior evening. Still again, his night was restless, and he dreamt about having to wake up at dawn and drive to the city with Roxanne and, for some reason, with their friends Daniel and Aaron, whose daughter Millie had coined the term family color. Also making cameos in the dream were actress and supermodel Shalom Harlow, with whom Adam had acted in 2 movies and directed in his movie I Love Your Work, but whom he hadn't spoken to in years, as well as her ex-boyfriend from that period, Peter Sarsgaard. The dream reflected the bifurcation of past and present, such as Adam had been experiencing it, as well as conjuring source material for the memoir he had spent the last 4 days not quite writing. Adam often felt his greatest performance was that of being an actor. And he had always felt his status as a sometime celebrity was opposed, doing step and repeats in the occasional interview, an imposter syndrome made more murky by an 8-year period of associations with a series of actresses more notable than himself. But Adam had felt even more removed these past few years from the world in which he made his living. He, on the one hand, was making more money than he had made in 35 years as a professional actor, the perk of slogging away on a network procedural TV show. But on the other hand, he felt more than ever like someone who was just punching a clock, albeit in concealer and bespoke Japanese engineer boots. The last time he had been associated with anything zeitgeisty was the television adaptation of the movie Fargo, in which he gave a performance he was rather proud of, and the closest he imagined he might come to being considered for an award up to that point. But, like so many of his performances, it would merely be award-adjacent. What about As If for a title? He asked Roxanne as she cruised by the kitchen counter to grab a seltzer from the fridge. Is it a memoir about Clueless? She giggled. So that movie you saw? 100 times, she said as she cracked open the can, grabbed a paintbrush, and left the kitchen. Not long after completing Fargo in 2014, Adam and Roxanne had their first living son, Bud. Living because just a year prior they had a stillborn child, Bix, whose heart inexplicably stopped beating at term. This tragedy was another fault line in the topography of Adam's biography. There would be a before Bix and an after Bix. And he and Roxanne would of course never be the same. The event didn't seem to haunt and consume them as much as they imagined it might, and as it did some others, for instance, the members of the one support group they attended in the week following the tragedy. People who seemed incapable of moving on years later. But they would never look at a pregnancy the same. Roxanne, who had never been touched by anything quite so shattering, had been hardened after breaking, or at least cracking, in the mournful year that followed. For Adam, though, it undergirded what in its best case promised to be an anxious fatherhood. It substantiated what he had always feared, that death was merely just a heartbeat away. Roxanne would insist Adam was confusing his prediction with prescience when he first heard Bix's heartbeat at the 6-week visit and broke down crying, convinced that his little heart was too tenuous to survive. Babe, if you worry about everything all the time, eventually you are going to be right about something. Adam pushed back, insisting he had known all along that this particular plane wasn't going to land safely. But deep down, perhaps he really knew she was right. Bet on bad luck with enough frequency, and eventually you'll win the tragedy lottery. But in either case, the tragedy had not made Adam feel any less uneasy about life, the lives of his kids, and his own longevity. This was one of the reasons he began to feel such urgency in finishing, or rather, beginning his memoir. His legacy, no matter how inconsequential or scattershot, needed to be memorialized. Come to think of it, he also needed to scrub some videotapes he had in storage. He imagined the looks of his children, or Roxanne, or some rando from an estate sale, and they discovered, buried amidst footage from his application films to film school, the sex tape he made with his girlfriend when he was 19, when home video, and sex for that matter, were still a novelty. Stillbirth and sex tapes? A memoir? After Bud and Sonny's spring play, Adam mingled awkwardly with the other parents around the refreshment table in the small front yard of the kids' woodsy progressive private school, ironically surrounded on all sides by a hellscape of lawns, littered with flags and MAGA propaganda. Adam was just famous enough to be self-conscious, which he had already been long before he began acting, but he was just unfamous enough for it to be a source of frustration, feelings of inadequacy, and near constant financial anxiety. The worst of both worlds, a title he was also considering. He was annoyed in equal measure when the parents seemed to be too interested in him, and when they showed no interest in him at all. He was embarrassed when he was occasionally treated preferentially at restaurants, and he was annoyed whenever the hostess at some local shithole told Adam that there wouldn't be a table for another hour. It was exhausting to affect surprise and gratitude each and every time someone told him how moved they were by his agonizing death scene in Saving Private Ryan, as if it were a novelty some 20 years later. And it was equally exhausting to be called a has-been with a fair degree of regularity by Instagram trolls who disagreed with his political views, as though, if even true, that was a relevant talking point. The worst of both worlds. Everything you always wanted to know about Adam Goldberg, but could give a flying fuck. A membrane. Today at the refreshment table, a parent from Turkey, in which he often joked he was huge after the film 2 Days in Paris gave him a disproportionately large fan base there, told Adam that he was the reason that he began wearing Ray-Bans. He instantly knew what the parent was referring to, as the Oliver Peoples, not Ray-Bans, sunglasses he wore in the film 2 Days in Paris had been the source of some mild internet speculation, which he knew from Googling himself early and often. The fact that this coolish Turkish dad with nice frames and a groomed beard told him he saw the movie when he was a kid seemed a gratuitous bit of context. The dad had actually been 19 when he saw it, but given Adam was 35 when the film was made, that made the Turkish parent roughly half his age at the time of production. Whatever style points Adam felt he had earned were immediately deducted by the reminder that he would be turning 55 this year. 55. An age he had imagined he'd be playing golf and shitting his pants. He'd never gotten around to golf. By the time Adam had returned home from the spring play, he was in the throes of a full-fledged vertigo spell. He had begun getting them while shooting Saving Private Ryan, actually. Lying on the beaches of pretend Normandy, which was actually somewhere in Ireland, amidst the cacophony of explosives and black diesel fuel, he began to feel the beach itself sway. And it never really stopped. Poor quality sleep exacerbates this condition, as does low blood sugar, anxiety, stress, getting up too fast, turning his head suddenly, working on a computer, nodding, walking, sitting, waking up, and other activities. While he lay fetal on the couch as Roxanne made him something to bring his blood sugar back up, he wondered how he would manage to sit for today's writing session, or even if it mattered. Should he just wait for his meeting with the book department? This was just IP after all, right? Wasn't he the IP? Maybe he just needed to dictate stories about 90s Hollywood and recollections of the less-than-zero-esque high school he attended in the 80s, with the likes of Moon Zappa and the offspring of nearly every famous 60s and 70s rock band. His carpool, that first year alone in 1982, consisted of Steppenwolf frontman John Kay's daughter, as well as Quinn Cummings, star of the television show Family, but moreover, of one of Adam's favorite movies growing up, The Goodbye Girl. Young Adam was essentially the Quinn Cummings character to what felt like an endless stream of Richard Dreyfuses who came through the door to live with him and his mom. This was the second time Richard Dreyfuss had come up in almost as many days. He began to wonder if there was any significance to that. Was Adam the Charles Grodin of Richard Dreyfuses? Not even, he thought, as he managed to get down some food and half an Ativan to numb his vestibular system, just enough to take his seat at the counter and open his laptop. Wait a minute, he remembered. The Adobe platform has an AI assistant. What if he were to simply dictate the episodes of Vertigo on the beaches of Saving Private Ryan, his obsession with Van Morrison's daughter in grades 8 through 10, and fruit-throwing anecdotes with A-list actors to the AI bot living in his laptop? This, after all, was no more than a purge, an exercise of sorts, right? It was just IP, intellectual property. More like a literate poser, he muttered. What was he thinking? Why was he doing this? Who would care? His head was spinning. He closed the laptop and decided he would meditate. He had recently begun practicing transcendental meditation as a last-ditch effort to find equanimity or something like God after a lifetime without either, and after several years of mindfulness only seeming to exacerbate his OCD. He became more determined to maintain a consistent and a qualitative practice, much like the journals he kept obsessively for years, that had become less legible and more compulsory over time. Wait a minute, he thought, as he sat cross-legged facing the Hudson, struggling to maintain focus on the mantra he had recently purchased in New Jersey for $1,000. The journals! He began keeping them in earnest on location while shooting Saving Private Ryan. Prior to that, he kept notebooks of ideas, poems, and lyrics, but he didn't begin keeping a draconian daily journal until the summer of 1997. The first was a small, leather-bound book in which he wrote with self-important fervor and painstaking legibility of a young artist whose recollections would someday surely matter. He began one night in a London hotel room, a few days after arriving on the eve of a week-long boot camp the Private Ryan cast were required to complete. The primary unit, Tom Hanks included, would spend 5 days bivouacking in the woods just outside of the erstwhile airport that the production was using to house their office and workshops. It was just far enough away and the conditions just miserable enough to give each of the Hollywood softies a taste of military training circa 1944. Adam was petrified. He had often even stated out loud, "I hope I never get cast in a war movie," but somehow, and without much effort, he did. In fact, the things for which Adam is known, when he's known at all, had required very little effort to secure, while the things which required multitudes of auditions or meetings almost invariably ended in disappointment. Adam, it seemed, was an actor you either wanted to work with or you didn't. This had put him in the perpetual position of feeling like he would never be promoted to executive, but would always have a job. He was both fortunate and unfortunate, the worst of both worlds. He had just enough success to encourage his ambition, but not enough to begin to satisfy his creativity or his vanity or his accountants. That first Saving Private Ryan journal is packed chock with tasty behind-the-scenes morsels which he could feed a hungry AI bot, he mused, legs crossed, facing the Hudson, as the recitation of his $1,000 Jerseyan mantra receded further into the background. You have been listening to Episode 2, Days 4 and 5 of Adam Goldberg, an unauthorized autobiography. If you've enjoyed it, please subscribe to the podcast or subscribe to the Substack, where you will find these words in their written form. What have you got to lose? It's free. For now.